Hello, this is Graham from Gramophones. On my website I've got a video on removing the spring from an HMV spring case. It's the kind of spring case with the circular clip that holds the lid down onto the spring. That kind of a spring case is used in this fella. This is an HMV number 59 motor from the 101 series of gramophones. It's also used in several other motors, but I thought in order to complete the picture I would do a short video on actually dismantling the number 59. It's a common motor. Well, it's used throughout most of the 101 series, as I say, and its sister motor, the 69, is used in gramophones like the 104 and the other table model, the 103, as well as possibly some other gramophones. I'm not quite sure, but it's certainly used in the 104 and in the 103. The only difference between the 59 and the 69, if you can see there, can you see this one? The 59 has an angled wind, which is therefore doing the angle wind on the 101 portables. The number 69 has a straight. This has got bits missing. I've used it for spares, but the 69 has a horizontal winding access. But for all intents and purposes, the rest, apart from the winding angle, is the same machine. So, without more ado, let's have a look at how we dismantle this. So, here we go. Let's dismantle this number 59 motor. The first thing we've got to do is to remove the three screws that hold the black outer case in place. Now you'll see I've already done that. I've done that with a number of screws during this disassembly so that it just speeds things up for the video. But you'll have three screws to remove there that will allow that outer case to come free. Now, before we go any further, what we need to do is make sure the spring in that case is fully unwound. If it isn't, when we remove that back plate, what will happen is any energy in that spring will be released and various components will go whizzing round. And if that doesn't damage you, it potentially could damage some of the gears. So, in order to check that the spring case is completely unwound, I'm going to just operate that lever that takes the governor pad, and I'm going to give this turntable several turns in the direction the turntable would go. That's clockwise. That will just make sure that any energy there has been released. That should just about do it. Release that lever, and now we can remove the bottom plate. Now, this is held with three screws again, one in each of the pillars and one that goes through the centre of the spring case shaft. That's the only one I've still got holding this this bottom plate on. So remove that, and now we're in a position to take that plate off. But before you take that plate off, a word of warning. There you can see there's a small socket. Now that socket takes the end of the turntable spindle, and in that socket there is a small ball bearing. That ball bearing should be held in place by God knows how many years of grease, but it could come free, so be aware that there is a ball bearing in there. Even if it's full of dirty old grease, when you clean it out, be aware that that ball bearing is there, because you could take it out and you could easily lose that. Underneath that particular part of the plate, which is on the top of the spring case spindle, there is a washer. Now, as I remove this plate, I'll show you the underside. That's the hole in which there will be a ball bearing, and as I look down here I can actually see the end of that ball bearing still in place in that socket. At this point though, and you can see in mine it's come off, you will find, if you've not serviced the motor before, that there is a washer, and it will be in that position and it will probably be covered by old grease, and old HMV grease goes very hard over the years, and so that washer may be embedded in a dollop excuse me, of old grease. What you need to do is obviously clean that old grease, but what you don't want to do is lose that washer while you're doing that. So those two things: beware, there will be a ball bearing at the bottom of that socket for the turntable, and there will be a washer that goes on that plate and sits between that plate and the end of the spring case. So at that point we can now start to take components off, and the easiest one to take off is the intermediate gear that goes between the spring case and the spindle. That will come off quite easily. Similarly, it will be easy to remove the spring case, and with the spring case will come the shaft that runs through the centre of the spring case that pull that off, that can be removed. Sometimes that will, it was quite stiff on this, that will be left on the actual shaft that comes up to take the spring case. Now, a word about this component. It's fairly straightforward to see how it's constructed. There's the basic gear with the centre shaft. There is a spring that will have a couple of prongs on it, one of which goes through that gear. I don't know if I can, there you can see the hole there. And the other prong that will, there it is, that will go through the felt washer. And finally, the last part of that prong will go through the top plate. Now, a word about that top plate: make sure that the flange is pointing upwards. So that little assembly goes together. It's fairly easy to see how that fits together, and there's no problem really with losing anything on that. Now, what have we got? Well, we've got now the remaining components on the chassis. We have the spindle. Now you can remove the spindle. It's held in place by two pins. One there, that's better, and on the other side there's a similar pin there. I don't bother to take those out. In fact, I use a principle on dismantling motors that I don't take off anything that I don't feel I need to take off. There's no point in taking off that. You can clean it up quite well with it in situ. Similarly, there is a brass gear on that spindle, and you can remove that. It's easy to find its relocation if you do take it off, because HMV kindly put reference points onto their spindles. So on this shaft there is a little depression that you feel for with the grub screw there when you're putting it back. But as I say, I don't bother removing any of that. I can clean it quite easily with the thing in situ. Over on this side we have the winding mechanism. Now, the winding mechanism can be taken out. I usually take this out to clean it because there is a non-return spring that sits on the shaft underneath that part of the chassis there, and it's nice to clean that out. So in order to get at that, we simply need to remove 3 screws. You can see I've removed 2 of them from the end of the winding shaft, from that little trumpet part there that sits with the flare that takes the winder. So I'll take that off. There we go. Now, word of warning: sitting in there is a washer, and again, that is something that can easily get lost. Remember, this is a fairly clean motor that I use it for spares, so I have been in this motor and cleaned various parts off. Yours may not necessarily be this clean, and things like that washer, although it looks quite easy to spot in this instance, need not necessarily be so when it's covered in 80-year-old grease. Finally, the last part is to release the non-return spring. Now that simply comes out, And once that's out, you should be able to use the end of that to pull the winding shaft out. Now, there we have it. Now, a word about this, not necessarily because you can lose any parts, you can't, they're quite big. But let me explain how that non-return spring works first of all. It works so that you can wind the gramophone up, and that spring will allow that to happen. But once you've done a wind on the winding handle, the winding handle is stopped from spinning back by that return spring. And the way it works is, as you're turning to wind, it expands that spring a little bit and allows that shaft to turn. Immediately, the tension of the spring wants to push it back. The tension of the main spring, that is, wants to push it back. That spring there contracts and grips on to that shaft in a firmer way so that it locks it, it stops it going back. Now, I have read that you shouldn't grease this at all. It should stay dry in order to fulfill its function. My problem that I found with that is that it can sometimes be a little bit noisy. And by putting a bit of grease on there, it stops the noise and I guess in a way cuts down the wear, but it doesn't interfere with its ability to stop that winding shaft turning under the pressure from the mainspring. You can remove that, simply turn it anti-clockwise and kind of unscrew it, pulling at the same time, and the two will come apart. A useful time now to check on that winding shaft. Just make sure that each one of those worms there, that worm gear, that all those turns are in good condition. There will naturally be some wear on there as there is on this, but you don't want anything too drastic, or otherwise you will find it's noisy when you come to wind the motor up. So that's that part. Now we come to another area where we're going to need to have a little bit of concern and careful dealing. We're coming to the governor armature. Now, to remove that, we need to undo two grub screws that hold the governor arm bearing in place. Now, whilst from this angle and looking at it, those bearings look to be the same, they are different. In the governor plate end, there will be a bearing that has let me take that armature out now, it's free. There will be a bearing that has a recess. You can see that there. So this bearing has a slight reduced diameter on the centre, 5 mm or so. That must go back into the pillar that is closest to the governor plate. On the other side, there will be what looks to be a similar bearing, but if you look, this one, instead of having a recessed section, it has a little groove. And it's important that that bearing goes back in the pillar next to the turntable spindle. The reason for that being there is that that's a reference point that HMV have put on it for locating that bearing. And the location of that bearing in that pillar is important because of its bearing upon the position of the armature. Because that is set, that point is set. As the motor is turning, it's going to push that armature into that bearing. And its position is important when it comes to speed setting. When it comes to being able to get the correct speed at the turntable, it's important that that's in there. Those people who've seen the Garrard videos will know that Garrard do not put those on their bearings. And if you take both bearings out on a Garrard motor, you've got a very old devil of a job to get the thing back in exactly the right place. HMV are much kinder. So they give us that bearing with a small notch so that we can put that in exactly the right position. Now, when it comes to the armature itself, again, I usually check this for cleanliness. Some people may remove all the components on the governor armature by taking out the grub screw that holds that brass assembly onto the shaft. Again, as with the turntable spindle, there will be a little recess on that shaft for the location of that grub screw, so you can get it back in exactly the right position. They will then take off all the springs, etc. And I just don't do that. I make sure it's all clean as far as I can see, and generally if the parts of the spindle are clean that you can see, you can bet the rest are. I check it there and give it a little tweak, and that feels all right, nice and free. And I lubricate it and check all the screws are tight, but that's as far as I generally go, unless the thing is really, really dirty, which I may take it to pieces. But I don't take things apart for the sake of taking them apart, as I said earlier. So that's that bit off. And the final part now is that little governor pad. Now, again, I don't take that off. You can with this. This one's secured by a screw and a nut. You could do, but I just make sure that's clean and free. It must be able to flick backwards and forwards. Any stickiness of that as it moves backwards and forwards must be removed. It's important that that spring is allowing that to flick back, so that when the speed controller is moved on the turntable deck, then as it goes either way, it will push that governor plate one way. As it moves the other, it will allow that spring to take that pad back, so it's always in contact. That lever is always in contact with the end of the speed control arm. So that is essentially it, apart from one further thing about the governor bearings. The position we said was important, which bearing goes into which pillar. But of equal importance is the fact that in each of those bearing holes there is a ball bearing. Now, they will tend to stay there, but if you soak, as some people do, all the components in paraffin overnight in order to get them clean, they may well come free. So do be aware that those bearings are there. And whatever system of cleaning you use, make sure that those don't go astray. It's easy to lose them if you soak them in a bath of paraffin, and having soaked them, the paraffin has turned black, and those two little ball bearings can sit in gunge and all kinds of rubbish. So be aware that they are there, and make sure that they, if they've come out, go back to where they belong. Right, that's the dismantling. All we've got to do is put it back together, and the assembly is just the reverse of the disassembly. Check things as you go. There is something to talk about on an assembled motor that I will do a separate little piece in a minute. But for the moment, we'll leave it there. The assembly of the motor exactly opposite, exactly the same as the disassembly, only in reverse. Okay, so we've got everything now back together. There are just two things really to do now. The first one is, and you may have done this as we've gone through, is to lubricate the various components in accordance with HMV's recommendations. These usually appear, lubrication charts are usually somewhere on every one of their models. It may have come adrift on your particular model, and if that's the case, there is a lubrication diagram for the 59 motor on my website alongside this video. So either you lubricate it as we went through, greasing and oiling the various parts that need those treatments, or you can do it now. The second thing we've got to do is create a little bit of play in the armature. Now, I did say that this bearing on this end by the spindle is the one with the groove in. So that bearing position is fixed. If you think about it, when the motor is being turned, that armature that's gear on the spindle is wanting to push that armature into that. We don't want to adjust that whatsoever. That is going to be set, and will allow accurate setting of or potentially accurate setting of a 78 speed at the turntable. However, we do want to create a little bit of play in that armature, and we do that by adjusting the bearing at this end, at the governor plate end of that armature. Now, usually what I do, you probably need to, well, you will need to release the governor plate to do this. Just give that, so you can hear that little knocking as the spindle goes between the two bearings. That's about right. You don't want too much movement on there. You just want that to be free, and then that locked off. And finally, the last part is to put back the case, add the 3 screws to hold that in position, and there we go. Well, I hope that proved useful. I hope you enjoyed the video, and well, maybe you'll come back and see me again sometime. Bye bye now.